cashier humiliates a veteran in front of everyone, until he fires her on the spot. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, should businesses be allowed to refuse service for any reason? And if you love justice stories, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. Jack Carter stood by the entrance of the small-town diner, his fingertips brushing the edge of his baseball cap. He wasn't one for dramatics, and he certainly didn't seek any special treatment because of his military service. But something felt off the moment he walked through that door. A hostess had greeted him a few days earlier when he came in with friends, but tonight there was a different vibe. The bright overhead light flickered slightly, casting a faint glow over the lightly occupied seating area. In the background, a tired-looking cook worked at the open grill. The smell of pancakes and fried bacon drifted in the air. As soon as Jack stepped forward, a sudden hush fell near the register. A young cashier named Melissa gave him the kind of look that made him pause, a hardened glare, as though she wanted to chase him back outside. He felt the tension instantly, and he couldn't figure out why. At first, he thought she was just having a bad day. Jack cleared his throat softly and approached the counter with his usual politeness. He had never been the type to force confrontation. He set his wallet down and offered a small smile. "Hi there," he said, keeping his voice calm. The cashier's eyes flickered to him, cold and dismissive. For a moment, she didn't respond at all. She looked past him, scanning the room as if searching for a more deserving customer. The only thing that moved was the small pen she tapped against the register, creating a soft, repetitive clink. Jack assumed she might be preoccupied or simply didn't hear him, so he tried again. "I was hoping to grab a cup of coffee. Maybe a slice of pie if you have it ready." Normally, that simple request would earn a nod and a smile from any diner cashier. Instead, her lip curled. She tossed her hair over her shoulder and mumbled, "We're out of coffee." Her tone was disinterested, borderline rude. Another customer, a young woman wearing a college hoodie, stood in line behind him. To Jack's surprise, Melissa quickly turned her attention to this newcomer, greeting her with an enthusiastic, "Hey! How can I help you tonight?" That was the first moment Jack realized something was very, very wrong. It wasn't about the coffee. His presence irritated this cashier, and he didn't know why. Maybe she'd had a run-in with someone in uniform before, or maybe she had personal issues against veterans in general. Jack could only guess. He found himself stepping aside to let the young woman order while he attempted to collect his thoughts. He wondered if it was worth making a scene or if he should just leave. He had come here hoping for a quiet dinner, not for conflict. He gazed around. A few other patrons, an older couple near the back, a single man reading a newspaper, took notice. The hush was back again, as though everyone felt the awkwardness in the air. Jack decided not to leave. This was a public diner, after all, and he had every right to be here. He cleared his throat once more, taking a step closer to the counter after the girl in the hoodie finished placing her order. The cashier didn't look up. "Are you sure you're out of coffee?" he asked, trying to maintain a polite tone. "I can smell it brewing from here." The pot was literally sitting on the warming plate behind her. She glanced at the pot, then back at him, narrowing her eyes. Her voice held a note of open hostility. "Yeah, we're out," she repeated, tapping her nails against the register again. "And we don't have pie either." Jack took a breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He'd encountered far worse situations during his military service. One rude cashier wasn't going to break his composure. But that old training, the discipline he'd acquired, urged him to hold his ground respectfully. He might have turned away if not for the casual cruelty in her eyes. After everything he'd seen and done, he understood the difference between someone having a bad day and someone looking to pick a fight. She was looking to pick a fight. He tapped the counter gently with his wallet. "All right, I understand if you're out of something," he said, voice steady. "But I can see the coffee pot right there. Maybe it's just not ready yet." He was giving her a chance to adjust her attitude, to realize he wasn't going to just slink away. She rolled her eyes so hard that the movement was visible even to the few customers behind him. The hush in the diner became louder than the sizzling grill. Something about that eye roll made him suspect she had a personal grudge against guys like him. Guys who wore the veteran cap, maybe. "Look," she said, her words clipped and icy. "We don't serve people like you." The phrase froze him in place. It took him a moment to process the meaning behind her words. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice faint with disbelief. "Yeah," she answered bluntly. "People who think wearing a uniform makes them heroes. People who treat the rest of the world like it owes them something." That's when he noticed a few heads turning fully in their seats. A middle-aged man with a thick mustache, reading the newspaper, lowered it to stare openly. Two teenage boys in a booth whispered to each other, eyes wide. The diner's entire mood shifted from mild curiosity to tense shock. Jack tried to swallow the anger bubbling up inside him. He didn't want to let it spill out. "I just want a cup of coffee, maybe a slice of pie," he said calmly, though his voice was taking on a guarded edge. "I'm not asking for any special treatment." Melissa gave a harsh bark of laughter that made the young woman in the hoodie glance nervously from her to Jack. "Oh yeah?" she said. "That's all you want? You military guys march in here acting like the world revolves around you. Well, guess what? We have the right to refuse service to anyone." Jack breathed in slowly, counting to 3 in his head to keep his patience. The nerve of this cashier was astounding. He had never demanded special treatment in his life. There was something else going on, some deep-seated animosity she held against the military or the uniform. Despite his growing frustration, Jack forced a civil tone. "Ma'am, I respect your right to your opinions, but I don't appreciate the disrespect." The cashier's smirk widened. "Disrespect? No, it's called freedom of speech. You should understand that, soldier boy." The hush in the diner grew denser, every pair of eyes now locked on the unfolding drama. In that moment, a young busboy emerged from the kitchen, carrying a plastic tub of dishes. He paused, sensing the tension. The look on his face said he wanted no part in this fiasco. Carefully, he edged along the wall, trying not to disrupt anything. Jack found himself on the brink of either walking out or confronting her further. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in his chest: anger, confusion, disappointment. He'd served multiple tours overseas. He'd faced adversaries far more dangerous than a rude cashier in a cozy diner. Yet the casual venom she spewed stung him in a place he rarely let people reach. He took a moment to gather his composure. Back in the day, his commanding officer drilled into him the importance of self-control, especially under verbal attacks. He had faced heated protests before, had been spat on once while traveling in uniform. He never lashed out. He never lowered himself to that level. But now, with an entire diner watching, he realized that if he left quietly, he'd be letting her get away with humiliating him and disrespecting every other veteran who might walk in later. Deep in his gut, he sensed something bigger was at stake here. So he decided to stand his ground. "I'm not leaving," he said, locking eyes with her. "I am going to stand right here until I either get my cup of coffee or someone with more sense steps in." Her lips twitched into a sneer, but she said nothing, almost as though she was daring him to continue. He let his gaze shift across the room. Nobody else dared to jump in yet, though he saw a few sympathetic faces. If a manager was present, they were nowhere in sight. Melissa crossed her arms over her chest. "Then you'll be standing there a long time." Her tone dripped with sarcasm. Jack felt the tension in the air thicken even more. And so, the standoff began. Jack stayed rooted, noticing how some of the other customers either started whispering or shifted uncomfortably. A woman at a nearby table gave him an apologetic look, as if to say she supported him but didn't want to get involved. Jack acknowledged her with a polite nod, silently reassuring her that it was fine. He'd handled worse. But inside, a slow burn was forming in the pit of his stomach. He'd come in simply wanting to enjoy a quiet evening. Instead, he was in the middle of a humiliating confrontation with a cashier who was making no secret of her disgust for him. Melissa finally turned her attention away from Jack to punch in the young woman's order: a burger and fries, plus a chocolate milkshake. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. This same cashier who said they had no coffee, or no pie, for Jack was happily taking orders from other customers. Even the young woman seemed uneasy about it, as though she didn't want to be served if Jack was going to be treated like garbage. She tried to protest. "It's okay, I can wait," she said softly, glancing nervously at Jack. But Melissa just ignored her, practically slamming the receipt onto the countertop. A moment later, the busboy re-emerged, eyes flickering anxiously between Jack and Melissa. He looked like he was summoning the courage to say something. Jack saw the nerves on his face, the half-open mouth, the shift of weight from one foot to the other. Ultimately, the busboy chose to remain silent, disappearing back into the kitchen with a mild shrug of defeat. Jack resisted the urge to confront her more aggressively. Instead, he pulled out his phone, considering whether he should call someone or record this. But then he decided against it. Filming her meltdown might escalate things. He wondered if there was a manager or an owner he could speak to. For now, he'd keep calm. If she kept pushing, he'd figure out a different move. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like hours as he stood there, arms folded, making it clear he wasn't about to be chased off by her hostility. The tension was thick, a near-tangible force that pressed on every occupant in the diner. Even the sound of the grill seemed quieter, as though the cook had turned the heat down out of curiosity or discomfort. Finally, Melissa broke the silence, addressing the entire diner as if she wanted everyone to know exactly why she was refusing service. "I don't care what your uniform is or what you did. I lost someone overseas, and I blame people like you for it," she proclaimed, voice trembling with a mix of anger and something else Jack couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps sadness. But her tone was so steeped in hostility that it was hard to extend empathy at that moment. "If you want coffee, go to a chain place. This is a small-town diner, and I decide who gets served at my register." Jack felt a pang of sympathy for her loss. He'd lost fellow soldiers during deployments, and he knew the pain of losing someone to the tragedy of war. However, it didn't justify her open cruelty or bigotry. He tried to keep compassion in his voice, but it was tinged with frustration. "I'm sorry you lost someone," he said, his tone measured. "But not every soldier is responsible for the war. We follow orders, we serve our country, and we protect people. That's what I did." Melissa let out a harsh laugh, the sound sharp enough to make a couple in a booth glance over uneasily. "Spare me the speech," she snapped. "I don't need your pity or your apology. I just need you out of here." Jack's jaw clenched. The suggestion that he was offering pity ruffled his composure. He tried one more time to be rational. "If the manager is around, I'd like to speak with them." She rolled her eyes. "He's busy," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "I can handle the front. I don't see a manager stepping in for you." That was when Jack realized she must feel empowered enough to do this in front of others without fear of immediate consequences. Maybe the manager was absent or incompetent. Maybe she felt she had some personal relationship with the manager that allowed her to get away with this. But Jack had no intention of slinking out in defeat. If she wasn't going to serve him coffee, he'd wait until someone else was available. Their standoff continued for another minute, each second fueling the unsettled atmosphere. Some customers, having witnessed the tension, quietly gathered their things and left, not wanting to be part of the drama. Others stayed, perhaps out of morbid curiosity or because they believed Jack deserved his right to be served. The door to the back office remained closed, showing no sign of life behind it. If the manager was there, he was either asleep or willfully ignorant of the confrontation. Jack glanced at the teenage busboy who had just emerged again, trying to see if he might offer help. But the young man seemed torn, eyes darting to and from the closed office door, as though he was waiting for the right moment to intervene. Jack wondered how far this would go. He considered the possibility of leaving and contacting the diner's owner privately, or even making a complaint through an official channel. But a voice in the back of his mind told him to wait it out. Something told him the situation was going to escalate before it got better. The cashier's rage seemed personal, and Jack, having seen conflict in more dire circumstances, recognized the signs of a confrontation that wouldn't resolve itself peacefully if left unchecked. The next stage of the conflict was about to erupt, and neither Jack nor anyone else in the diner would remain a passive observer. They had witnessed the venom, the blatant refusal of service, and the personal attacks. Now it was only a matter of time before something snapped. Jack steeled himself, determined to keep his calm while defending his dignity. He was no stranger to conflict, but it was never something he sought. Yet, in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to stand up, not just for himself but for every veteran who might walk through those doors and face a similar hostility. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to come next. The tension was real, and he could see the shift in the few remaining patrons. They were either behind him or too shocked to speak. Melissa's face flickered with a grim sort of triumph, as though she believed she'd won. Jack had no idea how drastically the tables would turn in just a short while, or that, by the end of the night, she'd be the one facing consequences she never saw coming. A moment later, a different kind of tension emerged. A couple of teenagers walked in, oblivious to the situation, laughing about some school gossip. They made it halfway to a table before they noticed the strange hush, the cluster of stares. One of them muttered, "What's going on?" under her breath, while the other simply shrugged. Melissa, spotting potential new customers, plastered on a quick, fake smile and beckoned them over, ignoring Jack's presence entirely. Jack watched in awe as she effortlessly switched from hostility to sweet sales mode, chirping, "Welcome, we have a special on burgers tonight." The hypocrisy was maddening. Jack couldn't believe how easily she changed her demeanor when it came to other people. It solidified his suspicion that her rudeness toward him was personal, maybe fueled by experiences or beliefs that made her resent anyone who had served in the military. He felt a swirl of disappointment mixed with anger. He'd seen plenty of disrespect in his time, but something about her attitude in this small-town setting struck him as worse, perhaps because it was so blatant and unapologetic. It was as if she believed there would be no consequence for her words and actions. The teenage customers, confused by the tension, decided to place a quick order to go instead of dining in. They cast wary glances at Jack, noticing that he was the center of attention for reasons they didn't fully understand. Melissa rushed their order with obvious cheer, as if she were trying to prove some point, maybe that she could be polite to anyone except people like him. Jack didn't budge. He simply let the kids order, pay, and leave. The moment they were gone, the hush returned. Jack glanced around the diner, noticing the wear and tear on the booths, the scratched-up floors, the flickering light overhead. It was the kind of place that thrived on local business, where regulars came in for coffee and chat. He found himself wondering how many of those regulars were veterans too, or had family members who'd served. But right now, none of them were stepping forward. Maybe they were all at home. Maybe they were at a different spot, and he was alone in this silent pushback. Then, an elderly woman near the window shifted uncomfortably in her seat, seeming torn about whether to speak up. Finally, she stood, walked over to Jack, and gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze of support. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face was kind and empathetic. Then, as though worried about confrontation, she gathered her coat and slowly made her way out. Jack exhaled softly, acknowledging her compassion with a nod. He could see the silent moral dilemma on everyone's faces. They wanted to side with him, but they also didn't want to escalate the conflict or get targeted by Melissa's sharp tongue. The question now was how long this standoff would continue before someone else stepped in. Part of him was starting to think about how he might handle the entire situation once it was done, but another part of him insisted on seeing it through. He felt responsible to set an example that you can't simply treat veterans, or anyone for that matter, with that level of open scorn. Melissa, for her part, seemed increasingly agitated. She continued to serve the occasional new customer who came in, though the vibe was so tense that most people grabbed takeout and left. Jack found it infuriating how she managed to snap from venomous to sweet in the blink of an eye, flashing a wide smile at each new patron while dripping condescension anytime she so much as glanced in his direction. He considered that maybe she'd had a terrible experience, maybe she was traumatized by something that happened to someone she loved. He could empathize with pain, but it gave her no right to treat people this way. One of the younger employees, a teenager who was refilling salt shakers at the tables, kept shooting Jack apologetic looks. Finally, she mustered the courage to sidle up to him while Melissa was busy at the register with someone else. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "She's been like this for a while. Our manager's in the back, but he's kinda spineless. We all know it's wrong. I wish we could do more." Jack nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he whispered back. "I don't blame you. Could you maybe get me a cup of coffee?" The girl hesitated, wringing her hands. If she sees me, she might freak out. I'm just trying to make some money to get through school. I don't want her to get me fired." Jack didn't want to cost this young girl her job, so he let the matter drop. "It's all right," he said softly. "I understand." He noticed how tired the girl looked, how her shoulders sagged under the weight of the tension. She clearly hated what was happening but felt trapped. Jack felt a wave of sympathy for her and everyone else who worked under Melissa's watchful, scornful eye. Perhaps the manager was incompetent or never around, leaving Melissa free rein to run the place as she pleased. Maybe that was why she felt so secure in dishing out her hateful remarks. Just then, Melissa's sarcastic voice rose over the ambient noise. "You done chatting over there, sweetheart?" she called to the teenage employee, making her jump. The girl mumbled an apology and quickly went back to refilling salt shakers. Jack turned to face Melissa again, standing by the counter. "Still here, huh?" she said, lifting an eyebrow at him. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a surge of conviction. He was going to keep waiting until something changed, either the manager came out or some resolution was forced to happen. Melissa sighed in a mocking, theatrical way. "Suit yourself," she said. "You can stand there till closing time." But as fate would have it, this night wasn't going to remain a simple standoff. Another presence was about to enter the diner, someone who would add fuel to the fire and set the stage for an even bigger confrontation. It started with the ring of the door chime, announcing a newcomer. Jack turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s walk in. He wore a faded jacket and a baseball cap, much like Jack's. There was something in his stance, rigid, confident, weary, that immediately told Jack this man was also ex-military, or at least had some background in service. Their eyes met, and Jack recognized the silent camaraderie that often passes between people who've walked similar paths. He saw the older man's gaze flick to the tension at the counter, the hush in the diner, and the worried expression on the teenage employee's face. Melissa was mid-sentence with a customer, so she hadn't noticed him yet. The older man scanned the room, taking in Jack's stance, the lack of coffee in front of him, and the vibe that suggested open conflict. Jack gave him a look that silently said, "There's trouble here," though he didn't speak. The older man nodded slightly, and in that unspoken exchange, Jack knew he had an ally in the room. He wasn't sure how the newcomer would react if Melissa started spewing insults at him, too. But he suspected that if she made a scene with another veteran, things would escalate fast. Sure enough, as the newcomer approached the counter, Melissa finished up with her current customer and snapped, "What do you want?" Her tone was sharp, lacking any courtesy. The older man raised an eyebrow at her. "I was hoping for a coffee," he said, voice deep. "You got any?" She shrugged. "We're out," she said, repeating the same lie she told Jack. He glanced at the pot sitting right there, fresh and steaming. His mouth tightened. "Doesn't look like you're out to me," Melissa scoffed. "Well, it's not for you." Jack felt the tension spike. This was turning into a pattern, blatant refusal aimed at veterans. The older man looked at Jack, then back at Melissa. "Is this how you run a diner?" he asked quietly. Melissa rolled her eyes. "I run it how I want," she said defiantly. "You people think you deserve a free pass everywhere you go? Not on my watch." The older man's jaw clenched, and a muscle ticked in his cheek. Jack saw the storm gathering in his eyes, the anger he was struggling to contain. He recognized it because he felt the same. But the older man simply pressed his lips together and said nothing, yet. He stood beside Jack, letting the cashier bury herself deeper with her own words. At that moment, the teenager who'd been refilling salt shakers nearly dropped one of them, sending salt cascading onto a nearby table. She blushed furiously and grabbed a rag to clean it up. Melissa barked at her. "Watch what you're doing, you klutz!" The tone was harsh, adding another layer of hostility to the diner's atmosphere. The older man shook his head slowly, taking in the chaos around him. He seemed the type who had a strict code of conduct, an internal sense of justice. Jack guessed he was an old Marine or Army man who didn't tolerate disrespect lightly. Melissa seemed to relish the tension, perhaps because it gave her a sense of power. Jack found himself exchanging a brief look of concern with the older man, acknowledging that the situation was at a boiling point, and it wouldn't take much more for something to erupt. He tried to gauge if it might be time to walk away, but part of him refused to back down. What if this was a test of sorts, a moment to stand up for himself and others? He had served overseas to protect freedoms. Did that include the freedom to belittle him? Maybe. But did it also mean he should quietly accept being treated like dirt? Absolutely not. So he remained firm, arms crossed, while the older man took a seat at a nearby stool, leaning on the counter with a calm but challenging look on his face. The two veterans formed an unspoken united front. The hum of the lights, the sizzling from the grill, and the occasional clang of a plate from the kitchen seemed to fade into the background. All that remained was the thick tension between them and Melissa, who seemed intent on pushing them until they either broke or left. What none of them realized was that a significant turning point was on the horizon, something that would force the manager, or even someone higher up, to intervene. It would happen sooner than expected, triggered by a small act of defiance from one of the staff. In that instant, the cracks in Melissa's pseudo-authority would widen, setting the stage for an explosive confrontation that would leave her scrambling for damage control. Jack braced himself internally. He had the distinct feeling that the next few minutes would change everything. The diner continued to fill with an uncomfortable stillness, punctuated only by the occasional order from customers who seemed desperate to get their food and leave. Jack held his stance, observing each new arrival with a steady gaze, making sure they understood that he wasn't being served, that he was being singled out. Some customers didn't want to linger long enough to make sense of it, others watched with curiosity. Melissa strutted behind the counter, her nose held high, pretending not to see the coffee pot that was clearly full. The older man sat there quietly, arms crossed on the counter, projecting an aura of calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. The teenage employee who'd whispered her apologies to Jack took a deep breath and finished wiping the salt off the table. Then she squared her shoulders and approached Melissa cautiously. "Hey, Melissa," she said, her voice shaking a bit. "Could I talk to you for a second?" Melissa turned, hands on her hips. "What?" she snapped. The girl swallowed, her eyes darting to Jack and the older man, then back to Melissa. She lowered her voice, but it was still loud enough for them to catch bits of what she was saying. "I really think we should serve them. They haven't done anything wrong. This is going to cause a scene, and the manager—" Before she could finish, Melissa cut her off with a dismissive snort. "The manager won't care. Trust me. And if he does, I'll handle it. You just worry about cleaning tables." The teenager's face fell, disappointment etched in her features. "But it's not right," she managed to say, voice trembling with frustration. Melissa waved her off with a flick of her wrist. "Don't tell me what's right. I've been here longer than you. Now get back to work." Jack felt a surge of respect for the teenage employee who had tried to do the right thing. This was someone who was willing to risk a bit of friction with her coworker. It might not seem like a huge stand, but in an environment where Melissa was so openly hostile, it took courage to speak up. The girl nodded, her eyes downcast, and returned to her tasks with a heavy sigh. Even that small attempt at defiance felt like a crack in Melissa's authority, something that might eventually shatter her hold on the diner. The older man quietly observed everything, occasionally meeting Jack's eyes. There was a shared understanding there. They were waiting. For what, exactly, either of them knew. Maybe they were waiting for the manager to come out, or maybe they were waiting for Melissa to slip up. Something had to give. In the back of Jack's mind, a question formed: would the manager side with Melissa, or would he see reason? Jack had encountered all kinds of managers and owners in his travels. Some were cowards, some were clueless, and some genuinely cared about fairness. The outcome hinged on which type they had here. Just then, the busboy, who'd been darting in and out of the kitchen, approached cautiously. Jack recognized him from earlier as the one who looked like he wanted to help but was too scared. He walked up to Jack, glancing around nervously. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't agree with what she's doing." Jack offered a small, tight smile. "Thank you. That means a lot. But I don't want you to get in trouble." The busboy nodded. "I know. It's just, this place is all I have for a summer job. But if it helps, I can tell the manager you want to talk to him." Jack arched an eyebrow. "Where is he?" The busboy looked around, ensuring Melissa was distracted. "He's in the back office, dealing with paperwork. Or maybe he's napping. I'm not sure. But he's definitely in there. I can try to knock or something." Jack nodded. "Thanks, I'd appreciate that." The busboy gulped and quickly disappeared toward the back. Melissa was busy with a few new customers who had just walked in, greeting them with fake enthusiasm. Jack noticed how these customers eyed him warily, probably wondering why he was just standing there without food or drink. The older man leaned in slightly and murmured to Jack, "This is crazy. You sure you want to stay?" Jack nodded without hesitation. "I do," he said. "I'm not letting her treat me like I'm not welcome in a public diner. We have as much right to be here as anyone else." The older man gave a small grunt of agreement. "Damn right we do," he said, glancing at Melissa with undisguised contempt. He kept his voice low so she wouldn't overhear. "Name's Thomas, by the way. Army retired." Jack shook his hand. "Jack Carter. Also Army retired. Nice to meet you." That brief exchange of introductions solidified their camaraderie. Two veterans, different backgrounds perhaps, but united in the face of disrespect. They both turned their attention back to Melissa, who had started flirting with a couple of younger guys who came in, tossing her hair, flashing a flirty smile, acting like nothing was wrong. She appeared to be the queen of hypocrisy. A few minutes passed. Jack occasionally glanced toward the back door, wondering if the busboy had managed to rouse the manager. He also kept an eye on the teenage employee, who was nervously taking an order at one of the booths. Tension permeated every corner of the diner, like static electricity ready to spark. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the busboy returned, a look of defeat on his face. He pulled Jack aside. "He's, not coming out," the busboy whispered. "He told me to deal with it, and that he trusts Melissa to handle the front." Jack clenched his teeth. So the manager was either too lazy or too cowardly to address the brewing conflict. Great. Thomas overheard the busboy's whisper and shook his head in disbelief. "Unreal," he muttered. "He's just going to let her run this place into the ground?" Jack shrugged helplessly. "Looks that way." The busboy's eyes darted to Melissa, making sure she wasn't watching. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "I can't do much else." Jack laid a reassuring hand on the busboy's shoulder. "You've done more than enough. Don't jeopardize your job for me." The young man gave a small nod, looking both grateful and embarrassed at his own powerlessness. Then he hurried off to the kitchen. Jack turned back to Thomas and said in a low voice, "I'm considering other options. Maybe I'll call the diner's owner directly, if I can find out who that is." Thomas scratched his chin, thoughtful. "Might be worth a shot. This can't go on forever." Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure how to get the owner's information. Then again, maybe the manager was the owner. He wasn't sure. The secrecy of it all, combined with Melissa's unwavering hostility, made for a toxic situation that felt nearly impossible to fix by normal means. At that moment, something changed. Melissa, done with the new customers, turned and fixed her gaze on Jack and Thomas. Her eyes were cold, challenging, and there was a hint of triumph in her expression. "You two still here?" she asked loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the diner. Jack and Thomas exchanged looks, bracing themselves. "Yep," said Thomas. "We're still here, waiting for that coffee you apparently don't serve." Melissa rolled her eyes, exaggerating the motion for maximum effect. "Yeah, well, you can wait all you want. I'm not serving you." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off before he could speak. "In fact, you know what?" she said, stepping away from the counter and coming around to the front. "You're both officially trespassing, as far as I'm concerned. If you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." A collective gasp rippled through the diner. People were now actively watching, some pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Melissa's threat had escalated the situation. Jack felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Trespassing? He wasn't loitering in a closed business. The diner was still open. He had money and every intention to order. She was the one refusing to take it. Thomas looked just as stunned. "You're serious?" he asked, voice tight with anger. Melissa folded her arms. "Dead serious," she said. "I'll give you one chance. Get out now, or I'll call the police." Jack took a slow breath, and for a moment, he wondered if leaving might be the best choice, if only to avoid the hassle of a police encounter. But the principle of it was too important. "You do that," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "Go right ahead." Thomas nodded in agreement. "I'll be happy to explain to them why you refused us service. And maybe they can help us have a chat with your manager." Melissa hesitated, clearly not expecting them to call her bluff. But her pride was on the line, and she refused to back down. "Fine," she snapped, reaching for the phone behind the counter. "I will." A part of Jack felt a surge of anxiety. The last thing he wanted was to spend the night dealing with the police in a situation that was so obviously petty and unjust. But he also knew that if he left, Melissa would have effectively won. She would learn nothing from this encounter except that she could bully veterans into leaving. Over Jack's dead body. Thomas bristled, standing up from his stool to face her square on. He looked like a man who'd seen enough nonsense in his life. Melissa glared at them both, pressing numbers on the phone. Jack couldn't hear if she was actually calling 911 or just pretending. The tension spiked to a fever pitch. This was the moment, Jack thought, the critical point of escalation. If the cops really came, it would be a huge fiasco. If they didn't, then maybe she was bluffing and would have to find another way to force them out. Before anyone could say another word, the door to the back office suddenly swung open with a bang. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt and an undone tie stumbled out, his face flushed. He looked disheveled, like someone who'd been yanked out of a deep nap or a boozy break. Everyone froze, including Melissa, who still held the phone. The man surveyed the scene with bleary eyes, taking in the angry stares, the phone's recording, and Melissa at the counter about to call the police on two customers. "What the hell is going on out here?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. A spark of hope ignited in Jack's chest. Finally, a manager, someone who could put an end to this madness. The question was, whose side would he take? The man's name was Tom, and the moment he stepped out, the tension in the diner seemed to shift. Every eye turned toward him, waiting to see how he would respond. Melissa lowered the phone slightly but didn't hang up. She looked at Tom expectantly, as if she believed he would side with her no matter what. "Tom," she said, taking on a sharper tone, "these guys have been causing trouble and refusing to leave." Jack felt his jaw tighten at the blatant lie. He wanted to speak up immediately, but he also wanted to see how Tom would handle the initial statement. Thomas crossed his arms, waiting calmly. Tom blinked a few times, trying to wake up enough to process the situation. "Melissa," he said, massaging the bridge of his nose, "what's the problem?" She pressed her lips together, her gaze flicking between Tom and Jack. "They came in demanding coffee. They refused to leave after I told them we're not serving them." She glossed over her insults, her refusal of service, and the hateful comments. Jack didn't speak yet, but a few of the remaining customers shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to correct Melissa's skewed retelling. Tom glanced around the diner, noticing the hushed crowd. A few camera phones were still rolling, capturing every moment. The busba and the teenage employee stood off to the side, their expressions screaming. "She's lying!" Tom pointed to Jack and Thomas. "Is that true?" he asked, not unkindly, but definitely with a note of impatience. Jack cleared his throat. "We came in for coffee, and she refused to serve us because we're veterans," he said plainly, not bothering to spare Melissa's feelings. Thomas nodded in agreement. Melissa let out a bark of laughter, dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, sure, that's the reason. Always gotta play the victim card, right?" She turned to Tom and continued. "You see? They're causing a scene, calling me a liar. I told them if they don't leave, I'll call the cops." Tom looked from Melissa to Jack to Thomas, scanning their faces. He took in the older man's stern posture and Jack's calm but furious eyes. Then he noticed the phone in Melissa's hand, partly dialed. With a heavy sigh, he raised a hand. "Okay, everybody chill. Don't call the cops yet. Let me figure this out." Melissa reluctantly hung up the phone, crossing her arms over her chest. "Well, hurry up," she muttered. Tom ignored her for a moment and approached Jack and Thomas, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm sorry. I was in the back finishing some paperwork. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Jack and Thomas took turns explaining how they'd each come in, only to be denied coffee, told that the diner was out of things that were clearly available, and insulted for their service. Tom listened, his expression shifting from confusion to a hint of disbelief. He glanced over at Melissa, who was drumming her fingers on the counter, looking impatient. When they finished, Tom rubbed his temples. "Melissa, is this true?" he asked, though his tone suggested he half believed the story already. Melissa shrugged, rolling her eyes. "I told them we didn't want their business. That's my right. Isn't that what you always say? We can refuse service to anyone who's disrespectful or causing trouble." Tom frowned. "But were they disrespectful?" A long silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the grill sputtering in the background. Melissa squirmed slightly. "I had my reasons," she said defensively. "They were giving me attitude." Some of the onlooking customers made disbelieving scoffs. One woman, seated nearby, gathered her courage to speak up. "They weren't giving you attitude," she said, voice shaking. "They just wanted coffee, like any normal customer." Another customer chimed in. She called them warmongers. More murmurs of agreement floated through the small crowd. Tom inhaled sharply, frustration coloring his face. "Melissa, is that true? Did you actually call them warmongers?" Melissa glared at the customers who spoke up. "It's my opinion," she snapped. "I lost someone overseas, and I don't want to serve people who—" She stopped mid-sentence, perhaps realizing she'd said too much. Jack felt a pang of sympathy for her pain, but that sympathy clashed with anger at how she was handling it. Tom stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm sorry for your loss, but you can't refuse service to someone just because they served in the military. That's not how this works." Melissa's eyes flashed. "So what? I have to pretend like I respect them?" Tom sighed, exasperation etched into his features. "You don't have to respect them," he said quietly, "but you do have to serve them if they're paying customers. This is a business, not your personal soapbox." Jack watched with a mixture of relief and wariness. Finally, someone with authority was saying what needed to be said. But would Tom really enforce it? Melissa threw her arms up, exasperated. "Why are you taking their side?" she hissed. "I've been here for years. I've seen how veterans act, coming in expecting discounts, acting entitled." Tom cut her off. "Stop. That's enough." His voice was firm, and it made Melissa flinch. "Look around," he continued, gesturing at the uneasy customers who were watching them like hawks. "You're making a scene and costing us business. People are either leaving or recording this. This is bad for the diner." Melissa's cheeks reddened as she realized the customers were indeed filming. She'd probably counted on Tom to support her unconditionally, but now he was clearly considering the bigger picture, the reputation of the diner, potential legal ramifications, and negative publicity. Tom turned back to Jack and Thomas, forcing a weary smile. "I'm really sorry. Let me make it right. Your coffees are on the house, and if you're hungry, whatever you want to order is free." He waved to the teenage employee. "Please get these gentlemen 2 fresh coffees, and whatever else they want." Relief flooded the teenager's face, and she hurried to comply, grabbing 2 mugs and heading toward the coffee pot. Jack gave a slow nod, glancing at Thomas. They had demanded only the right to order and pay, but if Tom was offering to comp them, that was his choice. "Thank you," Jack said, measuring his tone. "That means a lot." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Yes, thank you." Melissa stood there fuming, eyes darting between Tom and the coffee mugs. The teenage employee brought the mugs over to Jack and Thomas, hands shaking slightly. She seemed relieved to finally do what she thought was right. Jack gave her a kind smile, murmuring a soft thanks. Then he took a sip of the coffee, relishing the simple act of drinking what he'd been refused for so long. Melissa, meanwhile, looked like she was about to explode. Tom fixed her with a stern gaze. "We'll talk about this in the office later," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Until then, just do your job without the attitude. Understood?" She stood stiffly, refusing to speak for a moment, but eventually mumbled, "Yes," under her breath. It was clear she wasn't done fighting, but for now, she had no choice but to back down. A slow sense of relief began to spread through the diner. Customers returned to their meals or phones, the crisis seemingly averted. Jack took another sip of coffee, feeling the warmth settle in his stomach. Thomas did the same, the tension in his shoulders easing. They had won a small victory, at least in that moment. Melissa was put in her place. But Jack couldn't help noticing the flicker of resentment in her eyes. She glared at them both, then at Tom, as though she was planning her next move. The teenage employee came over to take their orders, offering them menus. Jack thanked her, scanning the options. He wasn't even sure if he felt hungry anymore. The stress had rattled him. But he also recognized the importance of making a statement by actually dining there. He didn't want to order a huge meal, but he also didn't want to just sip coffee and leave. "I'll have a slice of that apple pie, if you still have it," he said softly, glancing at Melissa out of the corner of his eye. The teenage employee nodded quickly. "Yes, of course." Thomas went for a simple burger and fries, plus a slice of pie as well. They handed their menus back, and the teenager rushed to the kitchen to place the orders. Melissa remained stationed behind the register, arms crossed tightly. Her face was locked in a grimace, but she'd been effectively silenced by Tom's intervention. Jack exchanged glances with Thomas, the slightest of smiles tugging at their lips. They could sense that the immediate battle was over. Still, it felt like a fragile peace. Tom lingered, arms folded, watching Melissa as if ready to step in again if she tried anything. The hush in the diner lifted slightly, replaced by the murmur of resumed conversations. People were still glancing over at Jack and Thomas, but now with expressions of support or curiosity rather than fear. Jack reflected on the craziness of it all. He'd only wanted coffee. How did it spiral into such a confrontation? He knew, from years of experience, that hatred can grow from deep wounds, personal or otherwise. But to take it out on random veterans who only wanted to enjoy a meal seemed so misguided, so unfair. He sipped his coffee again, letting the bitterness fade away. Relief settled in. At least, it seemed like they had a decent manager, albeit one who had been absent until the last moment. He also thought about how Melissa had threatened to call the cops, how she'd insulted him and Thomas openly, and how she refused to serve them. Despite Tom's attempt to pacify the situation, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was another storm brewing. He noticed the teenage employee returning with their food. She placed Thomas's burger and fries in front of him, then set down 2 slices of apple pie. "I warmed them up, hope that's okay," she said with a shy smile. Jack thanked her again, grateful for her kindness. Thomas patted his stomach, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm more than okay with warm pie," he said, forcing a grin. They both dug in, savoring the taste of something normal and comforting after all the hostility. A few minutes passed without incident. Jack started to believe things might settle down for the rest of the evening. Maybe he and Thomas would eat, pay their respects to the staff who'd tried to help, and leave. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Melissa approach Tom, whispering furiously. He couldn't catch all the words, but bits like, "I won't serve them," and "I'll quit," floated over. Jack tensed. Thomas noticed and quietly said, "Looks like she's not done." Jack nodded grimly, watching as Tom shook his head repeatedly at Melissa's hushed tirade. Finally, Melissa stomped her foot in frustration and marched away from Tom, muttering curses under her breath. At that point, Tom seemed to have had enough. He turned on his heel and headed back to the office, maybe to distance himself from her meltdown. That left Melissa behind the counter, glaring at the two men eating what she refused them just minutes ago. Jack kept his composure, not wanting to provoke her. But deep down, he knew they were on a collision course. She seemed incapable of letting the matter drop, and he wasn't inclined to tolerate her abuse. Yet, for a brief moment, the diner resumed a semblance of normalcy. Jack and Thomas ate in silence, exchanging a few words about their time in the service, about how they ended up in this little town. Jack learned that Thomas had retired years ago and was passing through, visiting family nearby. Jack was more local, but not a frequent diner patron. They bonded quietly over their shared experiences and the absurd drama that had unfolded. The teenage employee hovered in the background, occasionally refilling Jack's coffee or glancing worriedly toward Melissa. She seemed relieved that, for the moment, there was no shouting. Jack was nearly done with his pie when he heard raised voices near the kitchen entrance. He turned to see the busboy stepping between Melissa and the teenage employee, who were clearly arguing. The busboy looked panicked, while the teenage employee seemed on the verge of tears. Melissa towered over the girl, jabbing a finger in her face. Jack couldn't catch the exact words, but he sensed it had something to do with the girl's earlier attempt to stand up for them. Without hesitation, Jack stood, setting down his fork. Thomas followed suit, leaving his half-eaten burger on the plate. They made their way to the scene, ready to intervene if needed. Melissa spun around to face them, eyes ablaze. "Stay out of this," she hissed, her voice quivering with rage. Jack held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not looking for trouble," he said. "Just let the girl do her job." Melissa advanced on him, her finger now pointing at his chest. "Oh, I bet you just love to jump in, all heroic, right?" Her words dripped with sarcasm and bitterness. "Is that what you did overseas, played hero until the people you said you were protecting ended up dead?" A shocked gasp ripped through the few customers who remained. Thomas's hand balled into a fist, though he resisted the urge to swing. Jack's face hardened. Those words cut deep, making his blood boil. He refused to let her see just how much it hurt. Instead, he took a steadying breath and said, "That's enough." She ignored him, turning to the teenage employee. "You think you can disrespect me by serving these scumbags?" she spat. The teenage employee burst into tears, the emotional toll finally overwhelming her. The busboy stood awkwardly, wanting to help but unsure how. Thomas stepped between Melissa and the girl. "Back off," he warned, voice low and dangerous. That's when Melissa made a grave error. She tried to shove Thomas out of the way. Though he was larger than her, the act of physical aggression stunned everyone. Thomas recovered quickly, stepping back to avoid a confrontation. But the action drew immediate attention. The busboy called out, "Tom!" at the top of his lungs, hoping the manager would hear. People started pulling out phones again, capturing Melissa's meltdown. Jack felt the final thread of his patience snap. He realized this had gone too far, beyond refusing service, beyond insults. She was now bullying her coworkers, physically pushing customers. He traded a glance with Thomas, then turned to Melissa and said in a calm, controlled voice, "You can't do this. You're done." The stunned silence that followed was punctured by the sound of Tom's office door flying open again. He rushed out, face red with fury. "Melissa!" he roared, crossing the diner in quick strides. Melissa, heart pounding, spun around to face him. "What?" she snapped. Her bravado was still there, but Jack could see a flicker of fear in her eyes. The manager's fury was palpable. "Did you just shove a customer?" Tom demanded, his voice carrying across the entire diner. "Are you out of your mind?" Melissa opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. She looked around, seeing cameras recording, the teenage employee crying, the busboy shielding her, and two angry veterans who refused to back down. She tried to stammer something like, "He got in my way," but it died in her throat. Jack locked eyes with Tom and said, "Sir, this is unacceptable. She's harassing customers, your staff, and now she's getting physical." Tom nodded, breathing heavily, turning his furious gaze on Melissa. "We'll talk about this in private," he said in a tone that promised serious consequences. But even in the face of that threat, Melissa refused to go quietly. "I quit," she spat, stepping away from him. "I quit before you can fire me." Her eyes darted from Tom to Jack. "I'm not working in a place that coddles murderers." The word murderers made Thomas tense. A wave of shock passed over the small crowd. For a second, Tom seemed speechless. Then, in a shaky voice, the teenage employee sobbed. "You can't say stuff like that. You can't." Melissa turned on her, lips curled back in a sneer. "I can say whatever I want. I have freedom of speech, remember?" That was it. Tom had heard enough. "No," he said loudly. "You're fired. You don't need to quit. I'm officially firing you." Melissa froze, as if not fully comprehending. She'd stormed around all night, convinced of her own invulnerability. Now, the manager she believed would back her up was unceremoniously pulling the rug out from under her. "W what?" she stammered, eyes wide. Tom jabbed a finger toward the door. "Leave," he commanded. "Get your stuff and leave right now." Jack and Thomas stepped back, letting the drama unfold. Finally, someone was taking real action. The entire diner held its breath as Melissa sputtered in disbelief. Rage and humiliation battled on her face. She glanced at Jack, eyes practically aflame with resentment. "This is all your fault," she snarled, tears threatening to spill. Jack held her gaze, unflinching. He said nothing, offering no apology for standing up for himself. She turned to Thomas, her mouth twisting in a grimace of hate. But no words came out. She knew there was nothing left to say. In a final gesture of defiance, Melissa marched behind the counter, grabbed her purse, and stormed out the front door. The bell jingled overhead in an oddly cheerful counterpoint to the tense final note of her departure. When she was gone, silence settled, broken only by the teenage employee's soft sobs and the murmur of relieved customers. Tom exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He looked at Jack and Thomas, then at the rest of the onlookers. "I'm sorry," he said, sounding genuinely ashamed. "I had no idea it was this bad." Jack nodded slowly. Thomas stepped in. "Thank you for doing the right thing," he said. Tom gave a tired nod. "I should have stepped in sooner. I'm sorry to everyone who had to witness that. Coffee and pie are on the house for anyone who wants it." There were murmurs of approval from the few patrons left. Jack turned to the teenage employee, who was wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "You okay?" he asked gently. She sniffled and nodded, though she looked shaken. "I thank you," she managed to say. "I was just so scared. She's been like this for a while, but never so open." Jack gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Thomas walked over to the busboy, extending his hand. "You did good, kid," he said. "Trying to help out, letting the manager know." The busboy shook his hand, looking both relieved and embarrassed by the attention. "Thanks," he said. "I'm just glad it's over." Tom cleared his throat. "I'll make a formal report about this incident. If you'd like to give a statement, you're welcome to," he told Jack and Thomas. "But right now, Let me just say how sorry I am. Jack considered it, then said, I appreciate the apology. We'll stay a bit longer, finish our food. Thomas nodded. And maybe we'll come back under better circumstances. Tom attempted a grateful smile, though he looked exhausted. He cast a quick glance at the door, half expecting Melissa to burst back in. When she didn't, he turned to help the teenage employee steady herself. Jack and Thomas returned to their table, finishing their food in an atmosphere that was completely transformed. The tension had broken, replaced by a mix of relief and lingering shock. Some customers stood to leave, still buzzing with conversation about what had just happened. A few approached Jack to apologize for what he went through. One older couple thanked both him and Thomas for their service, tears in their eyes. Not everyone's like that, they assured him. Jack gave a modest nod, grateful for the sentiment. Thomas, for his part, took a few more bites of his burger, joking weakly that it was still pretty decent even after all the drama. Jack chuckled softly, the release of tension making him realize how hungry he actually was. After finishing their meal, they signaled for Tom to come over so they could settle up. True to his word, Tom insisted everything was on the house, even though Jack and Thomas politely tried to pay. Consider it an apology, Tom said, forcibly shoving their money back at them. We need to rebuild our reputation after tonight. Jack finally relented, putting his wallet away. He offered Tom a handshake, which the manager accepted gratefully. Thank you for stepping in, Jack said. Better late than never, right? Tom grimaced. I should have been out sooner. I'm going to make changes around here, trust me. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated again. Thomas patted Tom on the shoulder. We'll hold you to that, he said. With that, the two veterans made their way to the door. As they stepped outside, the crisp night air washed over them, offering a sense of freedom and closure that wasn't available inside the suffocating tension of the diner. Jack paused, turning to Thomas. Glad you were there, he said. Thomas nodded, giving a small grin. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. For both of us. They parted ways with a promise to keep in touch, exchanging phone numbers. Thomas walked off to where his truck was parked, and Jack headed down the street toward his own car. As Jack drove home, he replayed the night's events in his mind, the confrontation, the refusal of service, the sudden meltdown, and the final firing of Melissa. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Sadness that someone harbored that much hatred, relief that justice had been served in some small way. He worried about how someone like Melissa would carry that anger forward in life, and whether she would ever come to terms with her grief instead of lashing out at innocent people. But for now, the immediate crisis was over. Jack returned to his quiet home, the reality of what had transpired still fresh in his mind. He remembered the sight of Melissa's furious face as she stormed out, cursing them all. He remembered the teenage employee's tears, the busboy's anxiety, the hush of onlookers. And of course, he remembered that final, surreal moment when Tom fired her on the spot. It felt like a scene from a TV drama more than real life. But it was real life. And sometimes, real life was messy, unpredictable, and raw. He took off his cap, running a hand through his hair, and let out a long breath. The next day, rumors would likely spread around town about the blow-up at the diner. Customers might share their phone videos on social media, highlighting how a rude cashier was fired after humiliating a veteran. Jack wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that kind of publicity. He didn't crave attention or sympathy. Yet, he hoped that if people saw those videos, maybe it would stand as a reminder that prejudice and disrespect can't go unchecked. Maybe it would embolden more people to speak out against injustice, no matter how small or localized it might be. For now, Jack felt a calm sense of finality. He had stood his ground, not out of pride, but out of a belief that no one should be treated as second class. In the end, Melissa had faced consequences for her actions, consequences she never believed would touch her. Jack also recognized that behind her fury was real pain from losing someone overseas. He resolved, in his mind, to hold no bitterness toward her personally. If anything, he pitied her. But that didn't mean he excused her cruelty. Actions had consequences. That was the bottom line. He prepared for bed, letting the weight of the day settle in. Before drifting off, he reflected on a simple truth: standing up for what's right can be uncomfortable, confrontational, and even frightening. But sometimes, it's the only way to ensure that respect and decency prevail. Tomorrow, he would wake up, put on his cap again, and step into the world with the same quiet dignity he always had. Maybe he'd swing by the diner in the future, once the dust settled, to see if things had really changed. Or maybe he'd find a new place for his coffee. Either way, he knew he had done what he could to make a difference. That night he slept soundly, free from regrets. On the other side of town, Melissa was probably wrestling with her bitterness and anger, jobless and humiliated. Life had a way of teaching lessons at unexpected moments, and perhaps she would learn hers in due time. As for Jack, he had no desire to rub her downfall in her face. His only hope was that she would eventually confront her own grief and find a healthier path forward. In the end, that was out of his hands. But if fate ever brought them across each other's paths again, he'd face her with the same unwavering composure that had kept him strong all along. And he would remember this night, how a simple request for a cup of coffee revealed so much about human nature, both its darkness and its capacity for finding the right course when pushed too far.